morning, everyone. So I'd like to thank BFSB and AIBT for hosting this forum. I think the discussion this morning has been incredibly interesting. I'm really happy that Patricia Jackson went first. Someone joked earlier that she would take all the heat. And so I didn't bring my glasses, so I can't see you. I can't see whether you're frowning at me or angry at me. Hopefully I can see your hands raised, though. So this morning, if I can get this clicker working, I'm here to present on the Commercial Entities Substance Requirements Bill 2023. First, I'll start with a disclaimer, because I am here only in the capacity as an advisor to the government with respect to the Commercial Entities Substance Requirements Bill. My presentation does not indicate that there are any accepted interpretations by the government. It is a bill only, it's subject to amendment, and that's the whole purpose of this consultation session. I'll skip the background because the AG gave a very good background on why we're all here. I'll just say on the last point on this slide that it is very important that the Bahamas be determined to have a fully equipped monitoring mechanism for the purposes of the OECD's guidance. What that means from the OECD's perspective is that we have a monitoring process that is managed by a governmental authority that not only deals with data collection, but also has all of the policies, processes, and procedures in place in order to ensure what they call a high-quality review of the substantial activities requirement. And also that governmental agency is able to undertake proactive follow-up where required. So that's a really tall order for a governmental agency. We are hoping that it will be assisted by the fact that we have a technological solution that will work for data analysis, but it also requires, frankly, that the government audit, that they analyze the data, and that they are actually able to actively follow up. The reason that is important is because the difference between having a fully equipped monitoring mechanism and standard monitoring mechanism from the OECD's perspective relates to the breadth of information that a jurisdiction is required to spontaneously exchange with others. So CESRA 18 and CESRA 23 are both drafted on the basis that we effectively have a fully equipped monitoring mechanism in place. That is the assumption. If we were to have other than a fully equipped monitoring mechanism, not only would we have to exchange information in the three categories that we are presently exchanging information, so on entities that are non-compliant for economic substance purposes, entities that are conducting the commercial use of intellectual property on a high-risk basis, and entities that are serving tax residents outside the Bahamas, even though they are conducting a relevant activity. We would also have to exchange information on a broader basis in respect of all entities conducting relevant activities. And as the AG referenced, we now have a broader definition of included entities. And so that would be a great deal of information to spontaneously exchange. So that's why it's very important. The AG has already alluded to the objectives of the bill. I will just sort of touch briefly on each of these objectives. So the first objective really is to provide everyone in this room with clear rules of the road. There were a lot of challenges created by the lack of definitions in CESRA 18, and that was not adequately addressed by the guidelines that were issued along with CESRA 18. We are now taking the approach of having more definitive guidance, which I think is currently in formulation. And we now have very explicit definitions for each relevant activity. So we are hoping that it will support the classifications that these entities are already doing and that advisors are doing for entities, so that they have a clear legal basis for saying whether an entity is in scope or out of scope. The second objective I won't dwell on because it relates to data analysis, which I've touched on. Obviously, the authority needs to have high quality data in order to analyze and to audit for compliance. And finally, the AG also mentioned this, a key part of the bill is consolidating reporting in a few entities so that you're able to have timely reporting, complete reporting. And so that's the purpose of CESRA 23. So we're gonna really just touch on high-line material changes. I'm not going to take you through each provision of the bill because you've had the bill for a number of weeks now. What I'd like to say is because the guidelines are actually being formulated, we're not going to talk specifically about interpretations in this session. What we are happy to talk about is if you have any feedback on the definitions that are provided or on specific provisions of the bill. But obviously, guidelines will provide more instruction on gray areas like incidental activity or what happens when you have no relevant income in a year. So on the slide, you'll see summarized that we've provided more color on the definitions. The regulatory businesses are defined in relation to the relevant enactments. A key definition is financing and leasing. This is one of those businesses that almost every entity actually has some sort of credit facility, perhaps that they're providing to affiliates. The section or the definition also includes affiliate financing, but excludes leasing of land or an interest in land, and that was a key area that required more specification in the bill. Shipping business is now looking extraterritorially. So if you're conducting shipping business solely within Bahamian waters, that is not considered the relevant activity of shipping business, and you would be a non-included entity if you did that. Also excluded is the operation of pleasure yachts and fishing vessels, and all of these definitions can be found in CESRA, and they are cross-referenced to the relevant enactments. With respect to the commercial use of intellectual property, the definition now clarifies that it relates to the holding and also the exploitation of the intellectual property and receiving income from that exploitation. One of the key amendments that has been made is in the definition of holding business. This was a very unclear provision in CESRA 18, and it led to a host of interpretations, differing interpretations, depending on who you asked. The definition of holding business in CESRA 18 had this linkage with subsidiary activities. That linkage has actually been removed, and so the definition is now broader, but also at the same time, it will not capture certain activities, and I'll leave it there because there will be additional guidance. So holding business is simply acting as a pure equity holding entity. That means that you solely hold equity participations or equity interests in other entities, and you solely earn capital gains and dividends from that holding activity. Another key clarification is with respect to commercial entities. It has always been the practice, and I don't think that there's any advisor that has said that it was the intention to make investment funds subject to economic substance requirements. However, it was not clear in CESR 18. In CESR 23, investment funds have been specifically excluded from the definition of commercial entity. So an investment fund is not a commercial entity. Also not commercial entities, and this has not changed from CESR 18, are entities that are tax resident outside the Bahamas and centrally managed outside the Bahamas, and entities that meet the definition of resident-owned. We appreciate that there still requires some guidance on, how do you determine that an entity is resident-owned? What evidence are you required to upload into the portal, and things of that nature, but we expect that to be addressed in the guidance. So this is referenced as a key change, but it's not technically a change, but just a clarification. The economic substance test really is a combination of a number of different sections in CESR 23, but it is summarized quite completely in Section 7. Section 7 clarifies that there's really a three-pronged test to economic substance and a fourth prong if you are outsourcing the activities. And the three-pronged test is largely unchanged. It includes the first prong of that test is direction and management. And the section on direction management has not changed. It is still that you are conducting board meetings in the Bahamas given the extent of the relevant activities carried out, that there's a quorum of the board physically present in the Bahamas, that you're keeping entity minutes in the Bahamas, and that the board of directors has the experience required for managing the entity. With respect to this second part of the test, this was somewhat unclear in CESR 18, but we've made it the second prong, which is basically, are you generating adequate expenditure? Do you have adequate full-time employees? And I just note that the term is now full-time equivalent employees. And do you have adequate adequate premises and physical assets to justify those relevant activities? The third prong of that test is core income generating activities, referred to, or I will refer to it as SIGA. SIGA has to be conducted in the Bahamas, and there's an indicative list of what activities constitute SIGA depending on the relevant activity that you carry out. Different in CESR 23 is this concept of providing a definition of what SIGA actually means. And that definition is found, I believe it's in section 6(2). Core income generating activities mean activities that are of central importance to an included entity in terms of generating relevant income. Sorry, I did not address the fourth point, but that has not changed. Basically, if you outsource SIGA, that outsourcing has to occur to a service provider or other entity in the Bahamas. You must maintain monitoring and effective control over that outsourced activity. This third change relates to reporting, and we've already talked about reporting. The AG's mentioned it, I mentioned it in my introduction, but essentially, registered agents report on behalf of entities to the portal, and entities report information required by Section 11 and parts of Section 12 to their registered agent. The definition of registered agent is slightly broader than you expect. It includes a regulated entity that is providing a registered office. Of course, there are likely to be some contractual requirements in order to enable that to occur, but we think that that is a question that has to be internally decided by each service provider. The deadline for portal uploads is the same. We are considering, although a determination has not yet been made, of providing a deadline for actually reporting or reporting information required by Section 11 to the registered agent, so that is still under consideration. On the slide, I've also highlighted certain sections of the bill that you might want to review, which support what the AG mentioned, which is that we do not consider registered agents to have any obligation to verify the accuracy of the information provided to them. You are not required to classify clients if you are solely acting as a registered agent. Obviously, it's different if you are also acting as a director of the entity. But if you're solely acting as registered agent, you are not required to verify the reports that they provide to you. The sections referenced, and they're on the screen, are Section 11, which places the duty on the entity, 12.3, which is the sworn oath provision that was in the old bill, Section 19B, which actually is in the penalty provisions and relates to the fact that a registered agent actually has a reasonable excuse defense with respect to reporting, and Section 24, which provides broad protection to registered agents for reporting. They are deemed to be reporting in accordance with the Act, and they are not in breach of any rules of conduct that might otherwise apply. So the fourth key change is with respect to the extent of information that's reported. And obviously, the extent of information that's reported depends on the classification of an entity. The entity that will have to report the most is an entity that is subject to enhanced economic substance requirements. So those entities involved in the commercial use of intellectual property are reporting much more information than entities involved in other included activities. Similarly, if you are a non-included entity because you don't conduct a relevant activity, you are reporting very little under Section 11, unless you are non-included because you are conducting a relevant activity, but you're asserting tax residence in another jurisdiction, in which case you do actually have to say what relevant activity you are carrying on. So I referenced this term full-time equivalent employees earlier, and it may be slightly confusing to some, but it's effectively allows for a fractionalization of employees. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you get to count your incompetent employee as half an employee, or that you get to say, well, you left your brain at home today and your body's at work, so we're going to count you as a 0.2 of an employee. What this essentially means is that if you are an outsourced provider and you are providing your outsourced services using a pool of employee resources, you are able effectively to spread those resources among the entities, and further details will be provided as to how you effectively account for employees and employees' time. Other items to note, and I think BDO might mention this in their presentation, but there are no forms provided in CESRA 23. There were forms that were prescribed in CESRA 18, and they may or may not be valuable. We look forward to your feedback on that approach. But essentially, the portal is effectively the form. The information that is required by the Act is going to be tracked against what's in the portal, just to make sure that there are no inconsistencies between the portal and what is in the Act. Also, there's no requirement to submit a form from an outsourcing service provider. The information that will be reported, you do need information from an outsourcing provider to provide information on outsourcing, but there's no form that goes along with that report. So the fifth key change is with respect to compliance and audit. And of course, we all love this, don't we? Compliance. The authority needs to ensure that they are encouraging compliance, that entities know what they need to do to comply, and that's the whole reason that we are undertaking this exercise. The compliance process has not materially changed under CESRA 23 for any entity. So the authority has at its disposal a number of different powers to compel the production of documents, to conduct an on-site audit, to designate an approved auditor if they are not able to conduct an on-site audit. And all of these provisions remain largely the same in CESRA 23. However, CESRA 23 also includes effectively a stepped process for included entities where they are deemed to be or non-compliant with the economic substance test. That step process is that first the authority provides a notification, and that notification will request rectification of the deficiency within 28 days. Failure to comply with that notice requesting that rectification within the time period stated will result in a mandatory audit. If that audit is not then commenced within 45 days or not commenced at all, the competent authority will then assess a penalty of $50,000. And although the bill does not yet say this, it is likely that a daily default penalty will also be applied. Audit deficiencies will then result in a second notice within which an entity has to comply with that notice by 30 days from receipt of the notice, effectively. So what that means is the process from being advised of a deficiency with respect to economic substance is 28 days plus 45 days plus the time period within which it takes to conduct the audit plus an additional 30 days for rectification. I think we received some feedback on timelines earlier on in the bill, and we look forward to feedback, but this is what is in the bill as it stands. The sixth key change is with respect to penalties. I think people sort of looked at the penalty provisions and thought, oh, these penalties are incredibly stiff. They're so much different than in CESRA 18. But CESRA 18 had a broad penalty for offenses under the Act. So that penalty was $150,000 across the board. It did not distinguish between offenses which were intentional, which were flagrant, or involved concealment or fraud. And so we've attempted to distinguish between simple and I say simple, but late reporting type offenses, and offenses that are intentional and flagrant, and effectively, one has to have fraudulent intent when you're deemed to be offending these provisions. So for offenses under 19A and B, you'll note that the penalty provisions are much lower than offenses under 19C through F. The highest likely penalty is under Section 18 with respect to failing to comply with a notice of deficiency that results from a formal audit, and that's $300,000. So, transition. Because we are trying to make this a relatively painless process, we've given a lot of thought to transition. And the provisions of the bill with respect to transition are likely to change to somewhat align with this transition slide, although, of course, this is still subject to review by the Ministry of Finance and confirmation. But effectively, what we are proposing is that the entities will report on their status when CESR 2023 is effective, with the definitions that are contained in CESR 2023. It is not expected that the portal, it is not expected that the legislation will be brought into force before the portal is actually affected. Is that correct, AG? Once the legislation is brought into force, the old portal will be deactivated. And so you will now be in sort of the new portal system. What we are going to require from entities is that if you have reported, let's say you had a December 31st year end, and you still have time to report because you have until the end of September to submit your substance report. But let's just say you were especially organized and you decided to submit your report in February. We will require those entities to notify their registered agent that they have already reported, and to provide their registered agent with evidence of that reporting. When the registered agent does its first reporting in the portal, they will indicate which entities have already reported for that 2022 financial year. If the entity is an entity that is a pure equity holding company or holding entity under the new definition, and this is only for gathering information for the competent authority, you will have to report to your registered agent that your classification under the new bill is different than what you've reported for your 2022 year. That's largely so that we don't have the scenario where the competent authority has no information when the EU comes to the jurisdiction in order to assess the information in our reporting portal. So I've already touched on a few of these proposed amendments to the bill. Obviously, we talked about transition and updates to that transition provision, revisions to make the Compliance Commission the reporting agent for entities without registered agents, and also the introduction of certain default penalties. One thing we haven't touched on is the fact that there will be certain guidance-like provisions that are already in the Act, which were inserted largely because we wanted to make them clear. But I think on analysis, we want to ensure that we are giving industry with enough context on some of these provisions. So Section 7.4 in relation to relevant income, i.e. what do you do when you have no relevant income in a year? That will be moved to the guidelines, and you'll be provided more context on how you go about reporting when you have no relevant income. So finally, I'd just like to say that obviously you're free to provide your comments here, but if you have additional comments, we are running a really tight timeline. Obviously there's the legislative process, the bill has to incorporate amendments, and we have to be able to launch the portal in time to accommodate reporting by the end of September. And so you have to get your comments in by June 29th in order for them to be considered. And you're asked to send all of your comments to BFSB for those comments to be consolidated so that we can be provided with effectively one set of comments or one document to look at. So even though there is a Q&A session at the end of my presentation, Tanya, if you'll permit, I would like to push the Q&A section to the end of BDO's presentation, largely because I imagine some of your questions also relate to how the bill works along with the portal. So I think it makes sense for us to take questions at the end of BDO's session. Is that okay, Tanya? Okay. Sure. Well, then let's take a few of the bill questions, and then we can move on to BDO.
So, Ms. Allen, the first question is, do incidental interest-bearing loans to company officers in and of itself mean an entity is included in the finance category? Do incidental interest-bearing loans to company officers in and of itself mean an entity is included in the finance category?
So the definition of financing and leasing is pretty clear that it involves the extension of credit for any kind of consideration. So obviously that has to be conducted as a business. I will not go further to talk about what is considered to be ancillary as a financing and leasing business, because that will be provided in guidance. But in and of itself, I would think the answer is no.
Okay, next question. What was the reason for changing the definition of distribution and service center?
There was no definition of distribution and service centers business in CESRA 18. So there was no change of definition. It's a new definition.
Thank you. Can you confirm that investment funds are not required to file for CESRA?
So let's reiterate the approach that we're taking on CESRA. Nothing has changed. Every entity has to submit a report. In the portal, we're taking an all entities reporting approach so that we have all of the information necessary for analysis. And so even though they are not commercial entities, they are required to submit a report, because you'll note that Section 11 refers to information that has to be collected from any entity, and there's a definition of entity.
Thank you. Final question from the Q&A virtual section. What happens if an entity does not provide any economic substance reports to the registered agent? Will the registered agent be responsible for their failure to comply?
This is likely to be addressed in guidance, obviously, but the reason that Section 12 is framed, that's section, not Section 12, Section 19.2 is framed, 19B, is framed the way it is because we wanted to provide the defense of reasonable excuse with respect to penalties for non-reporting. Obviously, if a registered agent has an entity that refuses to report, then the registered agent has to carefully consider whether they should continue to act as registered agent, and perhaps there needs to be some guidance to that effect in the guidelines.
Okay, the questions are continuing to come through, but I have one more. What happens if an entity exists prior to 2019 and the entity has not filed any economic substance reports? Can the entity take this opportunity to submit all reports without receiving any penalties?
I'm not going to give advice, but I will say that in the old portal, you are still able to file. So I'm assuming that they will advise that person to file.
Okay, thank you. So we've opened the floor now to anyone who has questions relevant to the amendments.
Sorry, there's one other thing I wanted to point out, and I think BDO will mention it. I don't want to step on their presentation. But if you are a registered agent, just bear in mind that the beneficial ownership information you must have already submitted beneficial ownership information in relation to an entity in order for you to actually make the report under CESRA. BDO will clarify on that point, but I think it's an important point to note.
Good morning. Just wanted to know, because I didn't see the definition of a foreign tax resident. And the reason why I'm asking that, Aliyah, is because is the resident the entity or is it the individual? Because there's a case where the individual owns 100% of the entity. And we're trying to determine whether or not, because he has tax identification himself in another jurisdiction, is that his tax, does that suffice in terms of being exempt because he's tax resident elsewhere?
So, I mean, I think a person's personal tax residency is separate from corporate tax residency. So, without, obviously, this is sort of a very general scenario, but you'd have to examine the features of tax residency, which is effectively central management and control.
Okay, that answers the question, because there was a concern. Well, you just want to know if that would suffice, and obviously it wouldn't, because
one important thing for the guidance is what do you do for basically transparent entities, and that will be addressed in the guidance.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. So then the definition of a tax resident is the entity itself, not
yes, although obviously there are entities which are effectively transparent for tax purposes. And in other jurisdictions, there's guidance which basically tells you how you treat those entities. So we will provide further guidance.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay. So I think then, Tanya, I don't see, this.
Yeah, just a final question, Ali. The fund management business, it says, means the business of managing securities. So would the management of funds be a security? Would that fall under that category? Let's say there's an investment management business, he's just managing fund of funds. For all intents and purposes, is that in subject, just referring to this act in particular, is that the management of securities?
So the definition in fund management business is related to the Securities Industry Act and also the Investment Funds Act. and it talks about managing securities effectively on a discretionary basis on behalf of an investment fund. So we'll consider that question, and we'll get back to you on the point. Thank you, everyone, for your attention.